What's up everyone, welcome to Freelancing with Chris of Emery. I'm Chris of Emery and now it's finally time to do that After Effects tutorial I've wanted to do for a while. In this episode we will go from zero After Effects knowledge into animating this eyeball jumping across my table. Yes, there is an eyeball on my table, don't ask. Anyways, it will basically look something like this. You can download the PSD art files via the link in my description, or you can of course draw your own art and do your own thing out of it. So this tutorial will be in a few different parts, and if you feel you already know a thing or two on how to move objects around in After Effects, you can go straight to the eyeball part via the section links down in the comments. But if this is your first time jumping into After Effects, I suggest you ride along from the beginning. And nope, no one's dying in this episode, we don't have time for that, and I'm taking this really seriously. Let's just get straight into it. Part 1. Workspace. So when we first start up After Effects and get rid of that startup home screen, we see this front with a bunch of different panels. We have the project panel where we'll keep the links to all our files in our project. We have the composition window in the middle where we'll see what we're creating. Down here is the timeline panel where we'll basically see all our layers to the left and where and how they show up in the timeline to the right. We have some tools up here that are mostly grayed out because we don't have a project going yet. And then we have some option stuff to the right. Now if this does not look exactly like this for you, it might be because you have a different workspace setup. And that's easily changed by going up to Window, Workspace. And as you can see, I prefer to use Animation. Just click that and you should see what I see. Of course you can change this at any time. And if you're used to working with other Adobe products, you're probably familiar with how customizable panels generally are. However, if you manage to screw up the look, you can always go back to Window, Workspace and choose Reset Animation to Saved Layout. And everything is back to normal. Part 2. Setting up a project. So, in order to start, we need to create a new composition, and there's a few different ways of doing so. Since we just started up After Effects, we have the alternative of just clicking the new composition in our main window, and we'll get the composition settings in front of us. From here, we can name our composition, and I'll name it Setup. We can manually change the aspect ratio. Let's go with 1920 and 1080 here. Keep the square pixels. Choose a frame rate, which basically means how many frames will play every second. High number will give you a smooth motion, lower, more jerky. And in the drop down there's a few standards and I'll pick 24. Resolution is just for our display preview and something we can change later on. We want the time code to start at 0 and the duration of our video to be, let's go with 10 seconds. Pick a background color and then we hit OK. And boom! Suddenly our tools on top isn't any longer grayed out. We have our first composition in our projects panel, and down here we can see that we are actually inside our newly created comp with the timeline set to 10 seconds, just like we wanted. In our comp window, we see our composition area and can at any time, if the mouse is in the comp window, zoom in and out scrolling the mouse wheel, or move around by holding down the space bar and click dragging the left mouse button in any direction. So if we created our composition but feel like, damn, I should have made the duration 12 seconds instead of 10, then we just head back into composition and click composition settings. From here we can change it all over again if we want to. I go for 12 seconds and hit OK. Now our timeline is set to 12 seconds. If we want to see the full timeline, we can just zoom in and out however we want to by holding down the Alt key and scrolling the mouse wheel. Okay, so we may have a composition set up for our project, but that doesn't mean we have saved our project on our computer yet. And that's a good thing to do. In File, Save As, and pick a folder on your computer. And it probably goes without saying that you should have a routine of saving often. Not that I've had a lot of issues with crashes and whatnot, but those times it has happened, it was pretty devastating. So save often, and also take a few seconds just to check Edit, Preferences, Autosave, to see that this box is checked and that it will save every 20 or so minutes. This will create an autosave folder in the same folder you saved your project and can sometimes save you from horrible situations. Part 3. Cut the crap, let's create. Alright, so with our new composition ready, we're finally able to create something. Let's click the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle in our composition. So what happens is that I get this rectangle with a fill and a stroke. Currently, it's just a stroke that we can change the color and width of if we want to, but also activate the fill by picking a color for it. If I want it back into just a stroke, I can just click the blue fill text and pick none. The exact same option is available for the stroke option, but I want it in a solid color in order to see it better. So now with this selection tool selected, I can click and drag my object however I want to. If we look in our timeline panel, we see that the shape layer 1 has appeared, and I am now able to move this current time indicator however I want in the timeline. If I hit space button on my keyboard, we'll start a preview of our comp starting from the point where the indicator is, and then it will run through the entire 12 seconds before it starts over again. Oftentimes when animating, you're focusing on a short time span, and instead of playing the entire 12-second clip, I can shorten the work area. For example, I'm shortening it to cover from 1 to 3 seconds here. And if I put the indicator inside the work area and hit space again, it will now loop the work area instead of the full 12-second clip. Now let's say I want my shape layer only visible between the 2 and 3 seconds. Then I just click and drag the edge on both ends of that layer in the timeline. And when hitting space to preview again, we see that the shape is only visible during that time. Let's create some more stuff. By clicking and holding down the rectangle tool on top, we'll get the option of creating even more shapes. I'll go for an ellipse this time, and as you might notice, if the shape layer was selected, the ellipse will be created in the same shape layer. Same thing happens if it's still selected and I start drawing with the pen tool. However, if I first click outside of the shape layer in the timeline to deselect it, and then start to draw an object, it creates a new layer that can move and have its settings change on its own. You can change the layer names if you want to by selecting the layer and hitting enter, renaming them, and then again you can shorten it however you want to. You can duplicate it by clicking Ctrl or Command D, and this is very useful. If you have your indicator somewhere on your layer and hit Ctrl Shift D or Command Shift D, you split it up in two. For now, we have only created shape layers, and shape layers have their own set of settings that we will look more into later. But let's import another file into our composition. We do that by clicking File, Import, File, or the quicker way, just double clicking in our project panel. Select an image or video and hit Import, and it appears in our project panel. But why isn't it visible in our composition? Well, it's simply because we haven't put it in our composition yet. View the project panel just as this basket or something of links and files that you can put into your composition whenever you want to. So I move the image into my comp and boom, it's on top of all my other layers. And I can move it however I want in the composition, as well as up and down among the other layers in the timeline. Depending on what I have selected, creating a new shape layer from here does different things. I said before that with no selected layers and creating a new shape layer creates a completely new shape layer in the timeline. Having a shape layer selected in the timeline and creating a new puts a shape layer inside that layer. But if I have my image selected while creating a new shape layer, I cut out a mask of that layer. We'll look more into masks later on. So it's very important to know what you have selected and not in order to get what you want out of your created shape layer. If you screw up, you can always hit Ctrl Z to undo and try again. I move things around a little and hit space to watch my beautiful creation play out. Part 4. Let's animate! Okay, so it's finally time to put some movement into things. I want to clean up my scene and start a new comp. I go composition, new composition, name it animation, put the aspect ratio on 1920, 1080, 24 FPS and white background. Boom, as you can see, we're now in our animation composition, but can at any time go back into our first comp if we want to, either by double clicking the comp in project or just by selecting it in the top of the timeline. From here, let's create a text layer, since we haven't looked on one yet. I select horizontal type tool and click one time in the comp and write out something. In the character settings to the right, I can do changes if I want to. Just make sure to have the text selected when changing stuff. I move it up a bit to the left, deselect it by clicking the empty space of the timeline and create a shape layer underneath. Same thing, deselect and import an image from earlier by dragging it into my comp. I changed the size a little bit to have it fit. Alright, so here are 3 different types of layers: a text layer, a shape layer, and an image. If we click the roll down menu on each layer, we can see that the text layer and shape layer have their own layer specific options. But all of the 3 layers share that they have this transform options. Every visible layer in After Effects will have this transform option, and that's what we'll focus on now. Let's look at the transform options in the text layer. From here we can change a bunch of different settings on our text, such as the X and Y position, opacity, and rotation, among other things. If I hit spacebar from here, not much will happen. I may have changed the position of my text, but there's really no movement. In order to make something move in After Effects, we need to tell the software where an object is supposed to be on different occasions in the timeline, in order for it to create movement between the 2 points. Let's hit Ctrl Z to get my text back in place. And now, with the time indicator set on 0 seconds into my timeline, I hit the stopwatch for position on my text layer. This creates a keyframe in the exact moment on my timeline and indicates that whenever I move my objects right now, a new keyframe will automatically be created in that place. So I move my time indicator 2 seconds away and then drag my text to the right, holding down Shift to get a perfect horizontal path. The new keyframe is automatically created, and now when I drag my time indicator, my object is moving. I can, whenever I want, to click and drag these keyframes however I want to make the motion go faster with a smaller gap or slower with a longer gap. Let's try the same thing on opacity. So I want it to fade in from 0 to 100. Again, first set the time indicator, hit the stopwatch on opacity, drag it to 0, move indicator forward a bit and drag it to 100. I hit space to preview and bam. As I said before, all of the layers have the same transform option. And one thing to always make sure of before you start animating is where you have the anchor point of your layer. If I select my over-memory text layer again, we can see that it is placed in its down left corner, and since we only animated the layer in position, it wasn't so much of a deal where the anchor point was placed. However, if we just try and dragging the rotate options a little bit, you can see that it will rotate around these anchor points. So now I want to animate my shape layer in rotation around its own center. Let's first figure out where the anchor point is by selecting the layer. So we see that it's placed in the center of the entire composition. And if we drag its rotation value, we see how it rotates around it. But I want it to rotate around its own center. What you can do is to select the pan behind tool and manually replace it wherever you want to, or if I undo that and hold down Ctrl and double click the pan behind tool, it will automatically place itself in the center of the object. From here I can easily animate a rotation just like I wanted. As told before, even imported objects such as my image has the transform options, and much like any other objects, it has an anchor point that already seems to be centered. Let's just animate it in scale just to see how that works in the exact same way. Place the time indicator, hit the stopwatch, move the time indicator, change the value, and boom, keyframe created. Alright, so this is basically the backbone of all animation. One thing though, before moving forward, when objects are moving in the same constant speed like this, it quickly becomes kinda stiff. And an easy way to bring weight and life into our object is something called Easy Ease. I select my position keyframes on the Ovemry text, right click on one of them and select Keyframe Assistant and Easy Ease. They now change from squares into hourglass shapes, and if we hit spacebar, it's a little more smooth motion happening. If we still have the keyframe selected and click this little graph editor icon, we enter the graph editor that can scare a lot of people, but fear not, it's easier than it looks. So this is basically a graph of our selected keyframes, and if we select them and change the shape of the curve into something more like this, basically tell After Effects that the object will slowly increase in speed until here where it will be at its fastest, then it will decrease in speed until it hits 0 speed. Let's go out of the graph editor by clicking the icon again and hit spacebar to see the preview. And as you can see, there's now a much more interesting movement to the text. All keyframes are able to be changed with Easy Ease if wanted. Let's try on the rotating shape layer just for the sake of repetition. I select the keyframes, right click one of them and hit Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. Still keyframe selected, I enter the graph editor, and this time I maybe want it to be at its fastest rotation in the beginning, just to slow down into 0 with time. You can of course stay in the graph editor while previewing for quick changes if wanted, but I'm pretty happy with that. I suggest you play around a little bit with the layers, keyframes, transform options, and the timeline, because in the next part of this After Effects course, we're going to get real dirty. Part 5. Let's use what we've learned plus some more things and animate for real this time, yay! Okay, so I start with a fresh window, begin with saving the project in File and Save As. Alright, so if you've downloaded the art files from the description, double click the project panel to import the files. I go to my Ovemry i.psd file and hit import. I keep import kind to composition and also merge layer styles into footage and hit OK. So now we get this Ovemry I folder and composition in our project panel. Inside the folder I can see the eye and background layers, and from here I can either click and drag my layers just like we did before, or just double click the composition to enter it. Now I'm in the Ovemry eye comp and can see that my layers are in the timeline with the eye above the background just as I wanted it. Let's quick just check the comp settings, and from here we can see that width and height is set to 1920 1080 based on the size of my drawings. I keep 24 FPS, and then I want the duration to be at 5 seconds. Okay, so we want to animate the eye jumping in on the table from the left. I make sure I use the selection tool and select the eye layer. I can move it around however I want to, but we also see that the anchor point is placed in the center of the comp, but I want it in the center of the eye. So just like before, we pick the pan behind tool and change its position to the center. Now we're ready to start animating this thing. So I'll place it slightly to the left outside my comp. Make sure my time indicator is on the first frame, and then hit the position stopwatch to create a keyframe at that moment. Then I move the time indicator a bit and move my eyeball like this a few times, thinking I'm going for a few bounces, and then I roll. Let's minimize the work area a little bit and hit spacebar to see how this looks. Okay, so we may have movement along this path, much like how we wanted, but the animation itself doesn't have much finesse. So now it's time to go into detail a little bit. Let's first look at this path of movement. It's a little too much like a wave right now. And while we want that kind of movement in the top, that's not the case at the bottom, where we instead want these hard kind of bounces. But it's easily adjustable just by going in each of these bottom keyframes on our path and moving these bezier handles. As you might notice, the left and right handle are locked to each other, but by holding down Alt key and mouse dragging, you sort of unlock it and can move them separately. So I work my entire path until it looks something like this. I hit play and it looks a little bit better, but still kind of stiff. Select keyframes and give them some easy ease. In the graph editor we can adjust a little bit. Ideally we want the eyeball to not move at all when at the bottom. Pick up in speed and then again slow down at the top. And then pick up speed again until next bounce. It takes some work to get used to working in the graph editor and tweak to get that right feeling. It also depends on what kind of style and feel you want on your animation. At the end of my path, where the eye starts rolling, I don't want this stop motion. So I select that keyframe in the graph editor and put it up just a little bit, telling After Effects that I still want it in motion at this point. I hit spacebar and yep, it feels as we're getting somewhere. Let's go out of the graph editor again and look at rotation. I'm thinking I want some minor rotation between each bounce and then some more at the end where it's just rolling. So let's make sure we're at the beginning of the timeline and hit the rotation stopwatch to give it a keyframe. I think I'll go with 180 turn between each bounce, and since my starting point is in the middle of a jump, I'll set that to -90. First bounce is 0, next bounce is 180, and the last one is 360. And then just some more roll after that until the end. We'll fine-tune that one later. Hit play and let's see how it looks. Small steps, but it looks better and better. Let's give the rotation some easy ease to that last frame too. Now I'm starting to dig this. So with position and rotation animated, there's one more option I want animated, and that's the scale. I want it kind of squeezed together in those bounces and then stretched when jumping. So I take the time indicator until right before the first bounce and I hit the scale stopwatch. Here I want it to be slightly stretched out right before the bounce, and if I scale it, I can see that it will scale in both X and Y value. So we unlock that by unchecking the chain box and then drag it just a little bit. Then I move the indicator to the actual bounce where it's supposed to squeeze, and I change the value again. Then move it a little bit more and stretch again. From here I can feel the rotation starts a little bit early, so I move that slightly. When moving on to the next bounce, I might want a keyframe without changing the value, and you're doing so by hitting this little box, add remove keyframe at current time. Then I continue. Remember also that you always can select copy your other keyframes and paste for a quicker workflow that also gives you the exact same kind of bounces. I hit play and realized that I probably want the scale to go back to normal when the eyeball is at its highest. Boom! One last thing to finish this little animation off is that I want a small shadow to follow the eyeball, so that it actually looks like the eyeball is bouncing on the tablet. Let's do that by creating an ellipse. So first, make sure nothing is selected in the timeline, and then up among the shapes, choose the ellipse tool. I go to one of the bounces in the timeline and drag out my shadow shape. I double click the pan behind to center the anchor point on my shadow. And then of course I want it beneath my eyeball in the timeline. Let's change the fill color to full black. I changed the opacity of the shadow down to 25. Alright, so now let's animate the shadow so that it follows the eyeball all the way from the beginning to the end. I hit play and it looks cool, but it doesn't really follow at the end, so I just give it an easy ease with a curve adjusted so that it follows the eye. Also, I want it to move a little bit in size depending on how far the eye is to the tablet. So I create a bunch of keyframes at all the bounces where I know it should be at its 100% size. Then I move the time indicator to the middle of those bounces where I know it should be smaller. Again, I copy and paste keyframes to keep the same values. Okay, so I think I'm happy with this. Obviously, there's always stuff you can tweak to do it even better. Let's watch the preview in full quality to see how it looks. Sweet. Part 6. Let's render that thing. Okay, so with our new animation, we of course want to show all our friends and render a video. And there are a few ways of doing so. I won't go too deep into detail, but when I render something for YouTube, I often go File, Export, Add to Media Encoder Queue, and that starts this program called Adobe Media Encoder with our comp added to the render queue. From here, I make sure format is set to H.264, which will give you a really small output file in pretty good quality. You make sure that the preset is set to match source, and then click where I want my output file to go. Then you just hit start queue, and we go to our folder and can see that the file is in the location. Awesome! Now if you don't have media encoder for some strange reason, you can also hit File, Export, Add to Render Queue. With this option, After Effects will handle the rendering instead of handing out the business to another program. Same here, I won't go into much detail. I keep best settings on render settings. On output module, I click the lossless text and go Format, QuickTime. And then on format options, I usually go for video codec DNHR. Output 2, and I'll pick the same folder as before. I hit render, and here is sound when it's done. Comparing the two files, we see that the MP4 or H.264 file is smaller than the other one. Again, it's almost a video in itself talking about codecs and file formats. And to be completely honest, this is not really my area or anything I'm really interested in. There are a lot of people out there that are far more into the technical stuff. So if you're interested in diving into this, it's just a Google search away. Phew! That's it, people. I hope you learned something in this tutorial, and obviously we've just scratched the surface on this one. Let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in me going even deeper into After Effects, or perhaps show some other software. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye!